This is the Truth Be Told podcast, where we unlock the secrets of strategic communication. On April 19th, 1995, Timothy McVeigh parked a rented Ryder truck in front of the federal building in Oklahoma City and caused an explosion resulting in the death of 168 people, including 9 children. Our guest today, Jeanne Bishop, took a unique look at this horrific event, turning it into a lesson on perspective, communication, and empathy. In her book, Grace from the Rubble, Bishop shares the stories of Bud Welch and Bill McVeigh. Bud Welch is the father of Julie Welch, one of the victims of the Oklahoma City bombing. And Bill McVeigh is the father of Timothy McVeigh, the person responsible. We'll even hear about how Bud Welch and Bill McVeigh, two fathers that each lost their children, were able to meet and reconcile. Jeanne also shares with us her personal experience with tragedy, as she lost 3 of her own family members to a horrific crime. Jeanne is an adjunct professor at the Northwestern University School of Law, a felony attorney with the Office of the Cook County Public Defender's Office, and the author of 2 books, Change of Heart and Grace from the Rubble. This promises to be an emotional yet inspirational conversation. Let's jump into it. Hey everybody, welcome to this episode of the Truth Be Told podcast. I'm your host, Dave Thompson. I'm here today with Jeanne Bishop. Thanks for joining me today, Jeanne.
It's great to be here.
And it's sunny over there where you're at today.
Beautiful day.
Maybe about 2 months more to go, and then that may change quickly.
I live in the Chicago area, so you are right.
Right. So before we get into this, I know we've got an incredible stories that you are going to bring to us, not only from your own personal life, but from this experience of the Oklahoma City bombing. But before that, to give our listeners a little context, I know you and I met several years ago at I think it was a press conference. It was advocating for clemency for Brendan Dassey. And you were speaking from a victim's advocacy standpoint regarding death penalty or long-term sentences. And what kind of drove you to be interested in that case, if you remember? I know I'm putting you on the spot from a few years ago.
Well, I knew the attorneys involved, and they asked me to participate. And I'm always happy to, be a voice stating that, not all victims' family members want the worst possible vengeance that can be wreaked on the person who allegedly, harmed their family members. And I was there just to speak for the virtue of mercy in a case like this.
Yeah, and I know, listening to you speak then and the times we've interacted since then, and I bought one of your books after that, Grace from the Rubble, which we're going to speak a lot about today, but learning a lot about kind of compassion and empathy and the power of communication when it comes to these really kind of severe and heinous and terrible cases. And it's emotional and inspiring to hear your experience. So I know, outside of obviously your very successful career, you're with the Cook County Public Defender's Office and you're an adjunct professor at Northwestern, you're doing all this great work. But speaking specifically to kind of death penalty, we're advocating against that type of extreme punishment, but also just understanding what victims go through, I think is really important. And you unfortunately have some personal experience to that. And to the point you're comfortable sharing it, maybe you can share a little bit about what kind of drove your passion into this space.
So I grew up one of 3 girls in a safe, lovely community in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma. And my younger sister, Nancy, was just the apple of our eye, all of us. She was this sunny, funny, kind little girl that grew up into an even more wonderful adult. She was married at a young age, the age of 23. She and her husband wanted to have kids right away. And when she was 25, she gave us the great news that they were pregnant with their first child. And we were all over the moon, and we went to celebrate at this dinner and all hugged goodnight and said, we'll see you tomorrow. It was the night before Palm Sunday, 1990. And the next day at my church, I got a phone call from my father saying that Nancy and Richard had been killed. And I went to the police station in this little village of Winnetka where they were living, where I live now, and found that they had been shot to death. And for 6 months, nobody knew who had done this heinous crime. This happy young couple, no enemies, no reason that anyone should want to assassinate them the way they had been. In a home invasion where nothing was taken. And then one day into the Winnetka police station walked a young man who said, I know who did this. It was a friend of his, a teenage boy, who went to the same high school that Nancy went to in Winnetka. And he was arrested. They found the gun under his bed with a perfect match to the ballistics of the bullets in their bodies. All the other burglary tools he had used to break in, this trophy notebook he kept with writing about being a killer. We even learned that he had gone to Nancy and Richard's funeral. And because he was 16 at the time this happened, he wasn't eligible for the death penalty in Illinois. Back then there was a death penalty, but it was not for juveniles, only for adults. And when he was convicted and sentenced to the mandatory sentence that you got at that time for a crime like that, and that's life in prison without any possibility of parole, the first question the press asked me was, are you sorry that he couldn't get the death penalty? And that was the first time I got to say that I didn't believe in the death penalty. I don't believe in shedding more blood or creating another grieving family like mine. That it won't bring Nancy and Richard back. It won't honor their memories. And that was my first opportunity to speak out publicly against killing.
Well, and speaking as best as I can to what you have done to honor her memory and their memory is this work you've continued to do since then. You've got a strong voice, but just a compassionate way in telling stories of not only your own, but of others, to let people experience what is it like, to the best you can, to be in the shoes of a victim or a victim's family, and what are those emotions like. And so before we get kind of further into this specific story, in your personal experience, I'm curious about anger and emotion, and how do you, and I know you talk a lot about this, but what is that like? How do you withhold anger? How do you manage that towards the situation versus towards the person who might have committed this crime?
Anger is completely understandable. I remember for the longest time, I just wanted to know why. Like, why had he done this? And then once I finally met him decades later, in my first visit to him, I didn't even care about the why anymore. The anger part was gone. But he needed to tell me why, and he told me it, and it actually helped to know in a way. But by then, of course, the anger has subsided. I know that in my encounter with murder victims' families over the years, when I've been in situations where I've been speaking against it, some people don't ever lose that anger. It stays within them. I was speaking in a clemency hearing, and there was a woman who had lost her brother and sister-in-law in this horrific rape and murder home invasion. And she was red-faced and angry, and she said, every day I wake up wondering why these two men who did this to my family members are still breathing. And she said, I can't even say the words of my faith anymore in the Lord's Prayer about forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. She said, because I will never forgive them. And I was so heartbroken listening to her, because I thought, what are the chances that these two guys are waking up every day thinking about you? They don't even know you exist, probably. And probably they wake up every day thinking, what's going to be for lunch in the mess hall, and, maybe I'll get a visit. They're not waking up in this prison of hate the way that she was.
Right.
To the point where she couldn't even say the prayer of her faith, the prayer she was taught in her childhood anymore. They took her family members, and then she let them take that too with her hatred.
That is heartbreaking. And it's hard because from the outside, not experiencing that, it feels so easy to be able to say, get past the anger and live your own life. But I can't imagine in that moment, it's not something you can really relate to, I think, unless you've experienced it. And I'm curious for you, or when you've talked to other victims, and families, is there a pivotal point that's consistent at all that you see where people move from this kind of anger or resentment to, maybe it's not forgiveness, but it's the ability to move on? Is there something that consistently that you see?
No, and that's the beauty of it. I got to tell you a story that Bud Welch told and experienced. So you may remember that there was in the state of Connecticut a movement to try to abolish the death penalty in that state. And there weren't that many people on death row. It was looking like that could happen. And then this horrific rape and murder happened. This family, the Pettits, a doctor and his wife and 2 daughters, 2 men, parolees who shouldn't have been paroled, go to their house, rape 2 of the women, tie the women to their bed, set them on fire, and kill them. Dr. Pettit they beat within an inch of his life, and I think strapped him to some kind of beam in the basement. He managed to get out after they left, and he was so weak from loss. He lost like a third of the blood in his body and had to roll along the ground to get to a neighbor's house to ask for help. So when these 2 guys got arrested for the crime, he wanted the death penalty for both of them. He was adamant that he wanted it. So now when Bud Welch and some other murder victims' families like myself who are opposed to the death penalty came to Connecticut, the press was all there, and the first question they asked Bud was, Dr. Pettit lost all of his family members, all of them murdered. No family anymore, no wife, no children, and he wants the death penalty for these guys. And what do you say? And what do you say to Dr. Pettit? And Bud said to the press, I say to all of you, leave the man alone. He is grieving. He has just experienced the worst loss. He needs time to heal. Everyone is on their own timeline. There is no magic point at which, and now it's time to change your mind and heart about this terrible thing that's happened for you. And he said, and to Dr. Pettit, I just say, I'm so sorry for your loss.
Yeah. God, it's heartbreaking. I can't imagine and don't ever want to be in that position. But thankfully, for people like yourself and Bud, who I want to learn more about, that there's voices of reason and empathy out there, so people can relate that they're not alone in these spaces. And I know you speak really highly of Bud, and I want to kind of get into that phase of this conversation. And I mentioned earlier, I read your book. For those of you watching, I've got it in front of me. I think you have it behind you too. But Grace from the Rubble, I know, is one of 2 that you've written. And this one, it's the subtitle is 2 Fathers' Road to Reconciliation After the Oklahoma City Bombing. And I think it was in 1995 was Oklahoma City bombing, and we have Timothy McVeigh park a rented, I think it was a Ryder truck outside of the federal building, and lost 168 people, I think was the number I saw, including children, and hundreds of people injured. And through that chaos, and I still think today the largest domestic terrorist incident that we've had on U.S. soil here, you created relationships from that and are able to share some stories and the power of those stories. And that's what I want to expand into. And we've mentioned Bud a few times, so maybe tell me who is Bud Welch and who is Julie Welch, and what can you tell us about them?
So Bud Welch is one of 8 kids who grew up on a farm in Shawnee, Oklahoma. It was a dairy farm. And he shared a mattress with, it was like a 2-bedroom house, and he shared a mattress with multiple siblings, and decided when he was young that he didn't want to be a dairy farmer, getting up at 5:30 every morning to milk the cows, which you got to do.
Right.
And so he became a gas station owner. That's what he was, a gas station owner in Oklahoma City. He had 3 children over the course of his life. He got married as a teenager to a 16-year-old girl, and their little child died, sadly, when it was only a few weeks old from this heart defect. His second child is still living. His third child, though, his youngest child, his only daughter, is Julie Marie Welch. And she was born prematurely at only about like 1.5 pounds, and Bud just prayed that she would live. And she never got, I think, past 5 feet or so, very small in stature, but this feisty survivor, from the age of her birth. And he adored her. That's his only daughter. That's his baby. When she went off to college, he called her every day. And he said that when she called him Dad, he knew everything was okay at school and with her. but when she called him Daddy, that there was something up. And that's how close they were. So he was very proud of her. She was a great student. She could speak 5 languages, but Spanish was her main concentration. So when she finished college, she took a job in the Oklahoma City Federal Building, the Murrah Federal Building, on the first floor in the Social Security office, because they had a lot of particularly Spanish-speaking people coming in needing help. And that's what she was doing the day of the bombing. She was on that first floor, and she was with 2 other young women that worked in the office, and they were tasked with like kind of cleaning out this closet with stuff in it in the back. And then Julie alone was called to the front when there was this young man who spoke Spanish only that needed her help. The 2 women that stayed behind working on that closet survived. They were rescued after only 45 minutes after the bombing. But Julie was right at the front of the office and died in that blast. Timothy McVeigh, the young man who set off that bomb, deliberately picked the Oklahoma City building because the front of the building was glass, and it was 9 stories high. A lot of federal buildings all over the country are only a few stories high, not in this kind of standing in this freestanding space where you really get a great view of the building. He wanted to make the maximum impact possible. He wanted to kill the most people possible. And to have the glass so easily get blasted off caused the death of so many people. As you said, 168, including 3 women who were carrying babies that were so far in term that they had already named them.
That's terrible. And it feels like it was yesterday. We're almost 30 years past that event. And, from there and learning in the book, you do a really, really good job of sharing as best as you can who Julie is and through Bud's eyes. And it's really powerful. And you draw this kind of connection to her and really understand, what she was bringing to this earth before this terrible kind of ending of her life. And then you reach out to Bud Welch. So how does that happen? What is that? I guess what instigated that idea from you, and what did that first interaction look like?
So I first met Bud Welch after I had kind of publicly announced that I was against the death penalty, even though 3 of my family members were murdered. And Bud was part of a group of people called Murder Victims Families for Human Rights. And he was a member. Rennie Cushing, whose father had been killed, was a member. So many other people. Kate Lowenstein, whose father was a politician and shot to death by this crazed constituent. Bill Pelkey, whose grandmother was slaughtered in this brutal knife attack by this 15-year-old girl named Paula Cooper. All these people had forgiven the people who had done it and were advocating that they not be executed. And they were the most impactful, just miraculous people I'd ever met, because all of them saw that vengeance and hatred and wishing ill and evil on the perpetrators was not going to do anything to heal them, was not going to do anything to honor the lives of their loved ones. And that the best way to do that is to honor what they stood for. And for all these people, and for my sister too, those things were goodness, kindness, forgiveness, mercy, reconciliation. That's who they were.
Yeah, and so you learned about Bud through this kind of this group, right? This mutual passion. And then what started the conversations between the 2 of you? And you're like, how did that progress from kind of having this mutual, I guess, passion or belief into really sharing his story?
Part of it is that we're both Oklahomans. I was born in the Chicago area, but when I was young, we moved to Oklahoma City. That's really where I grew up. I was there until I left for college. And I think we had that kinship that way. Because there's this kind of Oklahoma tradition that you grow up with where these are prairie people. This is where if one farmer or dairyman, falls off a ladder and needs help, the community comes and they help milk the cows and till the fields and everything. And it's a place that is used to experiencing disaster from the sky, especially. It has some of the biggest and most destructive tornadoes on Earth. The highest wind speed ever measured on Earth in a tornado happened in Oklahoma. And so there's this kind of tradition of looking out for one another. And I instantly, connected with Bud because he is someone who is completely frank and honest. He'll say exactly what's on his mind, exactly what he thinks. He speaks from a heart that's willing to say, that he had started himself, feeling very vengeful for Timothy McVeigh. Said that the first time he saw him on television when he was being arrested and taken away in this orange jumpsuit, that Bud said he hoped that a sniper would take him out. But he's such a loving, open, honest man, and we became friends and are very good friends still. Every time I get a chance, I go and see him and his wife Lois.
So when you, in this first, and I think that's really insightful, is because, again, as we're talking about, communication, and you mentioned everybody's on their own timeline or their own kind of progression towards healing. And so when you're trying to show somebody empathy, you're trying to understand kind of Bud's perspective. You have your experience, so you have a commonality there, but again, everybody's different, as you mentioned before. So how is that interaction like when you're trying to talk with somebody else, another victim or a family member of a victim, and you're trying to say, I've been there, or I understand what you're going through, but maybe you don't understand what they're going through. I don't know if that makes sense, but is there a magic way you found to try to find that connection?
No, you're absolutely right. I never say I know what you're going through because, like, for instance, I'm the mom of 2 sons. I honestly can't tell you how I'd feel if somebody took the life of one of my sons, one of my children. I don't know if I could even go on breathing if that happened.
Right.
And the thing is that you don't know. You can never put yourself in the shoes of another person. Everybody's pain is very particular. I mean, one of the people I write about in my first book is a woman whose daughter, Susie, at the age of 7, was abducted, raped and murdered and dismembered and dumped into the river by a pedophile. And when she spoke about forgiving this man and praying for his good, I just remember shaking my head and thinking, you are beyond anything I could attain. I could never forgive someone the way you have. And yet, look at me, here I am all these years later, and I have.
Yeah, I think that's, for people that are listening, that's to me just the fascinating thing I got from going through the book and what we'll get into here with Bud's experience, especially with the McVeigh family. But people that are listening thinking, I could never forgive somebody, or even if it's not forgiveness, it's at least moving on independently in your life without letting that person distract you. Excuse me.
Yeah, I was right there with those people. I was one of those I could never people.
I'm sure, right? And then you're forced to, unfortunately, have to manage that differently, or understand it differently when you experience it. And so in this process, you reach out to Bud and you guys have some commonality of experience, and you're going through these conversations. At some point then, you also have decided to reach out to the McVeigh family and Bill McVeigh, who's the father of Timothy McVeigh, who happens to be from the Lockport, New York area, which isn't too far where I'm from here up in Buffalo. But I'm curious about that. Is that something that you've done in the past where you've talked to the parents of the person responsible for the crime? Was this a new venture for you, or what was that experience like?
That's such a great question because it really is the first time. And I knew that I couldn't reach out to Bill McVeigh directly because I understood from people that he's an intensely shy and private man. He grew up in the 5-mile perimeter around Lockport and lived there his entire life in this small town of Pendleton where he lives, just outside of Buffalo. And that over the years, there have been so many people trying to interview him, trying to, get him to talk with them so that they could write about it or film it. And with one exception, he had always said no. And I knew that it would only be through his friend Bud Welch that I could have access to him, and that, or that he would trust me. And I just prayed about it, waiting, because Bud said that he would do that. And Bill said miraculously that he would speak to me, but he called me the last one, meaning, you're it, I'm not ever doing this again, and he's true to his word. There's a man named Jeffrey Toobin that wanted to call me when he was writing a book about the bombing, and he wanted to see how he could get in touch with Bill McVeigh. And I said, here's his address, it's public information, but I can tell you right now he's not going to talk to you. And sure enough, he didn't.
Yeah.
It's very painful for him. And there's a part of him that I find, it just makes me drop to my knees. He says he doesn't really deserve to talk about this to anyone. When I told him, there's a whole wellspring of goodwill towards you in Oklahoma City. I grew up there. I loved you. You showed me around Buffalo and Pendleton and Lockport, because he did. He spent days showing me, the plant, the houses where they used to live, the school that Tim went to, and so on. And I said, I'd love to show you around Oklahoma City. And he said, I don't deserve to go there. Because he has taken on to himself all of the guilt and shame of what his son has done. A lot of parents, I'll read about some mass shooting or some terrible crime, and there'll be a quote from the dad or the mom like, oh, that's no child of mine. I have nothing to do with that person or why they did that. And Bud and Bill has done the opposite. Bill McVeigh has said, he is my son. I know he did this terrible thing. I can understand why people would never be able to forgive that. But I love him.
Yeah, I like that what you just brought up, because unfortunately in today's world, it seems like there's a mass shooting or a school shooting or a threat of a school shooting all the time. And I'm sure, every situation is different, but you have a lot of people looking at the family, right? Well, what created this problem, or why didn't you know this was happening? And some of these, there's maybe a lot of red flags, and some maybe there aren't any. But you've got this experience of talking to Bill McVeigh, who, unfortunately, his son was responsible for one of the worst things to ever happen in the U.S. from a domestic terrorist situation, and you have compassion for him. And so I guess that's the gap that maybe people don't realize, that sometimes parents just don't know what's going on, or were unaware of some of those red flags. Is that what you experienced in talking with Bill?
Absolutely. You bring up the fact that there are these situations where you can look at a parent. For instance, I think it was the state of Georgia, where there's a 14-year-old whose dad had given him an AK-47 for Christmas, even though the kid had already been interviewed by the FBI about alleged threats, and he ended up taking 4 lives, 2 students and 2 teachers at his school. In a suburb near where I live, Highland Park, Illinois, there was a horrific shooting a few years ago of multiple victims at a 4th of July parade, where there's grandmas and parents and children gathered to just celebrate Independence Day in our country. And this person, again, takes one of those sniper rifles and just starts firing randomly at people. His dad had gotten him that gun. Bill McVeigh was a dad who raised his son single-handedly. Tim's mom had divorced Bill and moved out of state. And so it was just Bill McVeigh and his son Tim living in this 1-story, 2-bedroom house in Pendleton, New York. And Tim, and I researched, confirmed this, never in trouble in school. No infractions whatsoever. Never on the radar of the police. He worked at the children's fair at the Good Shepherd Catholic Church in his neighborhood. He was confirmed. There were no red flags. His descent into the madness of white supremacy and hate happened when he joined the army at the age of 18 and was put in a cohort with these 2 co-conspirators. Terry Nichols was one of them, and was just poisoned, and Michael Fortier was the other. And he was just poisoned with this anti-government hate and rhetoric, and drawn into the rabbit hole of all these, readings and everything. And then he experienced trauma and PTSD over in the Gulf War in Iraq and Kuwait, and came home to a Western New York where they just weren't hiring. and he couldn't find a job that he felt was commensurate with his dignity. He only was offered like a low income security guard thing, and so it just fueled this anger against the government even more. And then when the conflagration in Waco happened, there was a 51-day standoff between the Branch Davidians holed up in this compound in Waco and the FBI. And finally the FBI filed tear gas and caught fire, and 26 people, including women and children, were killed. And Tim said, okay, that's it. I'm going to do this grand gesture against the government. And that's why he picked 2 years to the day, the anniversary of Waco, to set off the bomb in Oklahoma City.
The two co-conspirators, we know what their involvement, if any, was in the process?
Yes, I do. I did a lot of research for the book. Michael Fortier basically helped him case different locations. And he went to Oklahoma City as one of the locations that they were looking at to do the bombing. And he suggested, if you set the bomb, set it off here in the front, because that's where the glass is. It's easier to break. If you set it off in the back where the elevators were, there's more fortifications in the building and it would be less deadly. And so Tim McVeigh did exactly that. He pulled right up to the front of the building before he lit the fuses and set off the bomb. Michael Fortier was also his home in Kingman, Arizona, is where Tim was practicing with soup cans, setting up these barrels of fertilizer and explosive that he was going to do to see which kind of explosion would go in the right direction and cause the most damage. Terry Nichols is the one who actually helped him build these bombs, pour in the stuff into the barrels and help me. Tim McVeigh never could have done this heavy lifting with the barrels by himself.
And then, so Timothy McVeigh rents this Ryder truck and gets to Oklahoma City, and this terrible incident occurs. And I'm curious when, because it's kind of an interesting way that he eventually gets arrested. The police find out he was already, I think, detained at the time when they figured out he was responsible. Maybe you can expand on that. But I'm also curious, when does Bill McVeigh find out about what happened, and what's that look like?
So the day it happened, Bill was doing one of the many good things that he does. I mean, Bill McVeigh is the guy who was the Little League coach. He's got the bowling league with his friends from the plant. He worked like Bud Welch. He was a working man. He worked the furnace overnight at the GM parts plant in Lockport. And he was going to church. He helped manage the bingo. And of course, everybody at bingo was talking about this explosion that had happened, and he didn't really think any more of it. It wasn't until FBI agents came to his house a few days later that he understood, this connection. And of course, Bill cooperated completely all along the way with law enforcement, and is still friends with the lead FBI agent that hunted, down and helped prosecute his son.
Yeah, I think it's interesting is because people either don't remember that incident, or maybe they weren't born yet when the incident occurred. But even when you hear about anything like this, you immediately, when I say you, I mean collectively, I think people immediately just blasphemize the whole family, right? It must be just this terrible situation and upbringing. And I think what you do and what I continue to learn more about here is how powerful it is to share people's stories, because you can really learn and maybe even relate to some of their experiences. And I feel like, I'm curious what you think, the way you talk about Bud and the way you talk about Bill is in a completely different world. These two could have just been friends. They could, if they lived in the same neighborhood or the same area, they could have been colleagues and friends. And they have so much in common, and it's interesting.
Oh, it's eerie how much in common they have. When I was learning more about Bill McVeigh, so I feel like they're these almost like Irish twins separated at birth. They're only 6 months apart of each other in age. They're both from these big Irish Catholic families. Both grew up on farms, so they learned farming and just that connection with the earth and the weather and all that. They both went to Catholic schools all the way through elementary school up until high school graduation. And then they both became working men, as I said, one in a plant and one in a gas station. And they each had 3 children. And Bud lost his only daughter, and Bill has 2 other daughters, but he lost his only son.
Yeah, it's just unreal commonalities, and then obviously this terrible incident really drawing them both together in partnership with your experience, right, and bringing all three of you together.
Yeah, exactly.
It's powerful. It is eerie, but it's interesting, and it allows us to see the perspectives really uniquely. As you're talking to Bill, and Bud, I guess as well, but specifically with Bill because of maybe the guilt, and I'm assuming, but the guilt that he felt. I would imagine it has to be difficult, whether in your role trying to share a story and trying to understand him, but or also an investigator's role, is you want to ask questions where you would try to figure out like were there red flags, was there something, but when you ask those questions, it's almost like you are further placing guilt or implying responsibility. Is there a balance there, I guess, to how do you get information and understand, how maybe I saw my son do this, or maybe this was out of character, but how do you ask those questions without at the same time implying that maybe you should have caught that, if that makes sense?
Yeah, that's a great question. When I first got the privilege of doing one of many interviews over a period of like a year and a half with Bill, I think I did 2 or 3 visits out there to see him. And he was so generous about, showing me the room that Tim slept in, taking me down to the basement and seeing this locker where he'd stored some of his guns, because he was a real lover of guns. With these stickers that say, like, basically, I'm going to shoot you if you kind of come and take these away from me. And taking me to the school, and taking me to the church, and taking me to the other home where they had lived earlier, and just giving me a sense of the Tim that he knew as a child growing up. But he was actually equally forthcoming about how he noticed that, Tim, when he came home, would go like shoot out in the backyard, that he loved guns, he loved shooting, and then he and this other friend actually bought this property in the same kind of area where they could, kind of set off explosives even. And so he noticed things like that. He noticed that when Tim came back from war, that whenever Bill Clinton, the then president, or Janet Reno, the then attorney general, would come on the TV, he would start yelling at them, just real hateful things toward them and their, what happened and the government. He would write these letters to the newspaper about how, white men like him were not getting the jobs and they were being displaced, and that sense of grievance. He went on a kind of a grand tour of all the gun shows all over the country, and that's how he kind of made a living. Was he started out with some guns that had belonged to his grandfather, sold those, so he'd get guns and sell them at these gun shows. And that whole gun show circuit, at least at that time, was populated by people who were often white supremacists, who were, mostly men, just misogyny, love of weaponry, this whole kind of rabbit hole that he started to go down.
We don't have to get political in the conversation at all, because I want to stay away from that, but just high level. Is there anything you think we've learned from that, I don't know, parents or society or people should be aware of in today's world? I mean, everything you're describing, just it kind of thinks, I feel like it's, we're so close to implosion right now with that same kind of rhetoric.
Yeah, and I think it is because we are kind of going into our own silos of information where, I'm only going to listen to MSNBC and these other people are only going to listen to Fox News or whatever, crazy website there is,
right,
with conspiracy theories that are unsupported in any way by actual facts. And that's a danger, I think, for our country. And it certainly posed a danger to Tim McVeigh. Yeah. But once he got kind of separated from this community where he grew up, and a loving and stable and very faithful and good-hearted father, he just kind of descended into this darkness that led to him deciding that the best way to strike back against the government is to deliberately kill innocent people.
Yeah, I asked that question because I think, and what you illustrate in this example, you've got so many examples from the work you've done, the power of communication, right? People talking to people, listening to another side of a story, understanding their perspective. it mitigates so much of this this hate, I guess. And even if you think about it, I think Bud Welch is a great example for people to look at as somebody who's suffered through such unimaginable kind of terror and grief, but seems like from what you speak today and what you've shown in the book, a leader in this space of helping people move forward and helping people communicate even with themselves or with somebody on the other side of the courtroom to kind of move forward. But communication just seems to be kind of an underlying theme in what you've talked about.
Yeah, just showing empathy and compassion for someone's loss, for their justifiable righteous anger about what happened, and not to tell them, this is what I think you should do, but rather to just say, this is what I had to do. I'm not saying that you have to do this. I'm not saying you have to forgive. I'm saying I had to forgive.
Yeah.
And this is what it's done for me. This is what it's opened up for me. This is the burden that it lifted off of me.
The culmination of that, at least in the book, and I know you have relationships continue, which I think is also really, really important. And it goes to obviously who you are as a person, that your conversations with Bud and Bill weren't just for a book. You've maintained relationships and you're still, advocating for the right thing and maintaining friendships. But as far as the book's concerned, I was emotionally invested in the story because it's a true story. It's real people. But you actually were able to arrange the two of these fathers meeting each other. And that to me just, it's again, on its face seems crazy, right? You have got the father of the victim, one of the victims, Oklahoma City bombing, and you have the father of the person who's responsible for that death. And you're able to get them to engage with each other. So I guess, what was that an idea you had going into this, or what kind of spurred that concept?
Oh, I can't take credit for it all. I wish I could. The person who has the credit for putting Bud Welch and Bill McVeigh together is this little Catholic nun named Sister Roz. Sister Rosalind Rozukowski. And she's like this big, and her day job when I met her was being a counselor at Sing Sing prison, and her night job was this halfway house in Buffalo for people coming out of prison. So this is a woman with some incredible guts as well as deep faith, and she is the person that put Bud together with Bill. Bud wanted to reach out to Tim McVeigh before he was killed. There's this very moving thing where he's doing an interview, I think with Ed Bradley of 60 Minutes at the time. And Bradley was saying, what would you want to say to Tim McVeigh if you could? And Bud said, I would just want him to know that, I forgive him. He wanted to say that to Tim's face. He was not allowed to go see him. Tim McVeigh, I guess, rejected that visit. So he wasn't able to do it. And that's when Bud thought, well, if I can't talk to his son, I'm at least going to reach out to his father. And so Bud is a Catholic in Oklahoma City. And that's an environment where, at least at the time, it was mostly kind of like a more evangelical Baptist kind of thing. They're not a very kind of relatively small Catholic population where Bud lived. And so he figured he'd just call up a nun in Buffalo, and that person would know all the Catholics in Buffalo, which, as you know, living there is like finding a needle in a haystack. There's tons of them there, right? But Sister Roz was able to find Bill through his priest. And so she actually is the one who drove Bud out for that first meeting to meet Bill. And Bud tells the funniest story about how Sister Roz, like this other nun I know from here, just had a lead foot when it comes to driving, and he thought he was going to die before he went there. She's speeding and kicking up the gravel and kind of drops him off there. But it was the perfect person, I think, to do that, because after the meeting with Bill McVeigh, Bud was so overcome by emotion that he was in tears, crying all the way back to Buffalo, and he sat and talked for hours with Sister Roz, and she was able to help him kind of process what had just happened. This incredible meeting with the man whose son killed his beloved daughter, and just finding that common ground of fathers in utter grief.
Yeah, and I know in the book you write about kind of their experience in that first interaction and how Bill's as you mentioned, you described earlier, shy. Obviously, I would imagine he's probably in I don't know if fear is the right emotion, but shame maybe, or guilt when Bud's going to meet him. But it seems like Bud took the bull by the horns in the conversation and just and developed rapport about farming or about something that had nothing to do with what maybe everybody would think the conversation should be about.
Yeah. So Bill McVeigh has, when I picture a garden, I picture like this little plot about this big that has a
Right.
few flowers and a bush in it. But Bill McVeigh has a garden the size of half of a hockey rink. So picture a huge hockey rink and half the size. That's how big his garden is out in the back of this really big, teeny house, but really big backyard. And he grows corn and peas, carrots, tomatoes, potatoes, green beans, squash, pumpkin, everything out there. And since they both grown up on farms, Bud thought, I'll just, when I get there, I'll ask if I can see his garden. And so, of course, that's how you get Bill McVeigh to talk.
Right.
I mean, I write about it in the book, just about these little packets of seeds that he orders every year, and how he tends to it so faithfully. Bill has these little kids who live next door to him, and now they're coming over they want to help him in the garden. They want to help pick the tomatoes off the vine, or shuck the corn.
Yeah, I think that was a really interesting takeaway from the experiences. Again, we have a lot of people listening that are investigators and that might struggle developing rapport, entering a conversation with a victim or a witness or a suspect in some terrible crime, and they're so focused on the incident and they forget that a person across the desk or the room from them they're having a conversation with. And so I thought that was a really neat example in the book where Bud is entering into such a emotionally tense, potentially conversation, and is able just to break into just be a human first. I think that was powerful.
Yeah. And I mean, this is the moment that I'll never forget, is that, Bud didn't say, hi, nice to meet you, now I want to talk about your son. He didn't bring that up at all. It wasn't until they came inside and sat at this little table in Bill McVeigh's kitchen. And over the table is this high school portrait, this graduation portrait of Tim McVeigh. Fresh-faced, blonde-haired, nice, suit, tie, in this picture, just looking like this normal kid full of promise. And Bud looked up at the picture and he said, God, what a good-looking kid. And he said that's when Bill kind of leaned over and this tear started to come from his eye.
I can't even imagine. That's crazy. What a great, again, example of perspective, right? Of just until you're in that position, and even the difference in time, right? Looking at that picture of who Timothy McVeigh was at the time before all these things he was exposed to and happened. Maybe just a normal kid growing up and a proud father without realizing what was coming next. I think it's powerful. Again, as I read through your book, is just how you are able to tell these stories while preserving their voices. And I know we only got a few minutes left, but I wanted to just kind of get your take on that, because there's some journalism obviously is a part of this. Is how do you interview someone and you're not telling their story to advocate in front of a jury. You're not trying to argue for somebody to listen to your side. You're really trying to genuinely share the perspective of two people from two different perspectives. How did you manage to do that?
I wanted to use exactly their voice. I wanted to use exactly their words. I didn't change a word of what they said.
Yeah.
I wanted it to be authentically what they did say, because I think that they're both incredibly eloquent in their own way, and I'm so glad that that came through, the power of their voices.
I from a reader's standpoint, I said definitely did, and I mentioned this earlier, but Julie as well, right? You feel like you got to know these people, and they're real people, but you got to actually feel like you know them just reading through the way that you kind of channeled their voices through the book, which is really neat. What do you wish for people that either just listen to us talk or listen to you talk in other context, or if they listen or read the book, what do you hope they take away? What's the message?
That you don't have to live in anger and hate and retribution. You don't have to live that way. You can live in the freedom of forgiveness, of love, of joy, of remembrance of your loved ones. You can let go of this desire to strike back, and you can open up instead your heart to let them in.
Yeah, what a perfect summary. And for the investigators listening, because I know we've got, again, a lot of people, there's such a personal timeline to go through, like you mentioned before. But whatever kind of grief somebody might be dealing with is how you manage through that is kind of on your own timetable. But even investigators, interviewers, or just workplace, professionals that have to interact with employees when they've done something bad. But it's separating the incident from the person is what I took a lot away from this. Is, again, everybody is human, regardless of the extreme act they may have participated in. But understanding as a person, as an interviewer, as a journalist, if you're trying to let somebody tell their story, you have to create a platform for that. And so that's really my last question for you: is what do you think is your own strength or your own skills that allow people to feel so comfortable in such vulnerable positions to share with you?
Oh, that's a lovely question. I mean, I think that I go in not with my agenda. I just want to listen to them. I just want to ask them to tell me their story. And so much emerges when I don't go in with an agenda, like this is what I'm trying to get from you, right? Just to really get to know them as a human. I mean, that I already kind of knew Bud Welch over all the years we had worked together. It was really getting to know Bill McVeigh as a human first, where he got to school, where he went to get milkshakes and burgers when he was a young guy, where his farm stand was when he was selling vegetables on the road. I mean, just to know them as a human being and to love and appreciate them. Yeah,
it's a great takeaway. If people want to, and I recommend it, but read this book, grab this book or your other book, or learn more kind of about your work, where do you suggest they do that?
You can order the books, the Change of Heart book, the first book from Westminster John Knox Press. They're in Louisville, Kentucky. And you can get the Grace from the Rubble book about Oklahoma City from HarperCollins.
Perfect. And I know you do a lot of work, around the death penalty conversation. So I challenge people just to learn more about that and be informed about that process and kind of where we're at state by state, and continue to do good work for Cook County and working with students at Northwestern. So I thank you so much for your time, for all the dedication you put into the stories, because I know it's a ton of research that people don't see for you to make sure you get every detail right. So I appreciate all the work you put into that, and the stories that you're able to share on behalf of both Bud and Bill. So appreciate your time today.
Oh, thank you so much. It was a pleasure.
Please make sure to like, share, and subscribe. And to keep this conversation going, follow the Truth Be Told podcast on LinkedIn and Truth Be Told CFI on Twitter. On behalf of the International Association of Interviewers, Rick Lander-Zalowski, and our valued sponsors, thank you for joining us on this episode of the Truth Be Told podcast.